Thank you so much to Pastor Jorge. It is truly a delight and a privilege to be here with you in the big family tent at this camp in Brisbane, Australia. Somebody asked me, have you been to Australia before? I said, yes. Where have you been? I said, to Sydney. He said, well, this is really your first trip to Australia. What a beautiful country, and what a wonderful privilege it is to join you here. We have many Aussies in my part of the world. They're in Loma Linda, California. Some of you may know Dr. Lynn Behrens. Dr. Behrens served as the president of Loma Linda University for many years and made a powerfully positive impact on our community, on our school, even on our church. We love Dr. Behrens and appreciate you sharing her with us. Graham Stacy, compatriot of yours, was on our pastoral staff for a period of time. And a dear friend of mine named Lee Aveling hails from the land down under. Now, Lee told me a story, knowing that I was from Texas and he was from Australia. He told me, he said, a Texan and an Australian fell into conversation. And the Texan, as is typical, wanted to impress the Australian with the size, not only of Texas, but the size of his ranch. He walked him around different parts of it, pointing in different directions. And finally he said to the Aussie, he said, my ranch is so big that if I get in my truck and drive all day, I won't reach the other end of it. To which the Aussie said, yeah, I used to have a truck like that myself. Being from Texas, I'm not sure why I told that. But it truly is a delight and an honor to join you here, to look forward to a week together, to spend the week in the life of Jesus. We will meander around through his life, both the incidents of his life, the teachings of his life, and I hope that by next week we will be able to say, as we leave this place, that we know him better than when we came. Would you pray with me once more? Gracious God, as we come to your word, we pray that your Spirit would descend on us, would bless us, and would open our eyes to see Jesus more clearly. In his name I pray. Amen. It was the night of April 14 on board the ocean liner Californian. The ocean liner Californian had progressed to within 1,500 miles of her destination, Boston Harbor. It was about midnight on the Californian when Second Officer Herbert Stone was due for watch on the bridge. He arrived on the bridge only to find his apprentice seaman glued to a pair of binoculars staring at the black horizon. In conversation with the seaman, he asked him what was going on. The man replied, I seem to have spied the lights of a distant steamer over on the horizon. Second Officer Stone took the binoculars, and he too could make out the lights of a distant ship. While they were watching, a bright white flare lit up the night sky in the direction of the distant steamer. The seaman told Second Officer Stone, that's what drew my attention there in the first place. They watched, they contacted the ship's captain. The ship's captain said, I want you to try to establish some form of communication, by radio, by Morse lamp, some way to find out if all is well. They tried in different means, tried by means of the Morse lamp, no response. They tried sending out signals by means of the radio, no response. So Second Officer Stone dismissed the seaman and said, I'll take over. He was there for over a period of another hour or so, watching that steamer in the distance. Several more times, bright white flashes of light lit up the night sky. But nobody on board the Californian interpreted those lights to be as cries for alarm, though they should have. They didn't. They didn't probably because they were continuing to send radio messages to that steamer and were receiving no reply. Thus it was that Second Officer Stone on board the Californian, just a few miles away, close enough to have been of great help, had a ringside seat for an unimaginable drama. He stood there while some miles away, the Titanic sank into the dark sea. Close enough to have responded, maybe saved some of the doomed passengers. If one other thing had been true, they might have responded. If on board the Titanic, the radio operator had responded. Unfortunately, it was later determined that the radio operator was fast asleep. Never heard the offers of help. And because one slept, many died. There was another night, another sea, a storm, another boat in which one slept. I'd like to take you to that story. It's found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, it's a familiar story, one you have read, no doubt, time and again. One on which you may have heard sermons preached, maybe heard it told at your mother's knee as a child. That was true for me, and it wasn't until I was reading it some time ago in adulthood, some years back, that it struck me that there are two questions that any observant reader of the story ought to ask. Two how could you kinds of questions. You know what kinds of questions those are, don't you? They sound like questions, but they're really more statements of blame. They tend to say something is wrong here, and I think it's you that is the problem. How could you? A wife here asked her husband that last Friday. She sent him out quickly to the store. Sunset was approaching. She knew she needed some final details for tomorrow's lunch where people were coming after church. She sent him racing out. Be sure and get what I told you, especially get eggs. He returns 45 minutes later. He has donuts. He has cheese. He has the sports journal. And he has no eggs. And she asks him, how could you? That's the reason I sent you. How could you possibly forget? That's the how could you kind of question. It's the kind of question that the parent asks the child who proudly brings home her geography exam and says, look, almost a perfect score. The parent takes the exam and looks and sees, yes, you've identified all those islands in the South Pacific correctly. Except for one. That big one. And the parent looks at the child and says, how could you miss that one? That's where we live. That's Australia. How could you miss it? You know those kinds of questions. They're questions. They disguise themselves as questions anyway. But they're really statements of blame. There's a problem here, and I think you're the problem. I'd like to ask two how could you questions of the participants of that night's drama on the lake. But first, read the story. Mark 4, beginning in verse 35, says this. That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Two how could you questions. The first how could you question I would like to ask of the disciples. And since I've read the Gospels and have noticed that Peter is the one who typically speaks, I would probably end up in conversation with Peter. So I would like to ask him a question. It's an obvious kind of question. I'd like to say to him, Peter, help me understand something. I want to ask it respectfully of you, Peter, but I do want to understand. How is it possible? How could you? How could you possibly be afraid when Jesus was in the boat? How could you, Peter? After all, even by this point in his ministry, you have seen him do some remarkable things. You have seen him heal the sick. You have watched as blind eyes saw for the first time. You have seen previously paralyzed legs move, lips that were dumb speak. You have seen some remarkable things. You have seen this teacher hold the crowds in the palm of his hand. You have seen remarkable things from this man, Jesus. Yes, you're in a storm. Yes, the waves threaten to wash over the boat. But Peter, how could you be afraid when Jesus was in the boat? Now, I wonder how Peter would answer that question. Maybe Peter would say to me, well, wait a minute, Randy, you have to understand. Jesus is very good at what he does. About that, let there be no doubt, no question. When it comes to healing, he has no peer. When it comes to teaching, he has no colleague. When it comes to preaching, there is no one who can compare. Jesus is very good at what he does. But Randy, when it comes to the sea, when it comes to ships, when it comes to storms, that's what we do. We have spent our lives on this lake. We know it well. We understand exactly what happens when the winds come whipping down the gorges that surround this sea and whip it into a fury. We know the storms. So I guess we just figured. We knew the storms. He did not. If we couldn't do something, then neither could he. Maybe Peter would answer my question in that way. Or maybe Peter would say something like this. Maybe he would say, I understand, Randy, your question, but understand we've grown up on this lake. When a storm blows in, we know exactly what to do. We get the boat headed into the wind. We trim the sails. We get all arms rowing. We get every help to bail out of the boat. We know exactly and precisely the best ways to handle a boat on a storm on this lake. And we did all of that. We did exactly what needed to be done. And if we, the fishermen, couldn't do it, then what was he going to do? A teacher from Galilee. Maybe Peter would say that. Or maybe he would say something like this. Maybe he would say, Randy, we did everything we have learned throughout our lives as fishermen to do. We took every action that we had learned from our fathers before us to engage in a storm at sea. Nothing that we did was enough. In fact, we became so desperate, so frantic, so caught up in our attempts to keep the boat afloat that, Randy, I'm embarrassed to admit it. I'm ashamed to say it. But we just forgot he was there. I suspect Peter might have said something like that. Especially when I read these words from that timeless classic book, The Desire of Ages, where Ellen White writes, the sun had set, and the blackness of night settled down upon the stormy sea. The waves, lashed into fury by the howling winds, dashed fiercely over the disciples' boat and threatened to engulf it. Those hardy fishermen had spent their lives upon the lake and had guided their craft safely through many a storm, but now their strength and skill availed them nothing. They were helpless in the grasp of the tempest, and hope failed them as they saw that their boat was filling. Listen to these words. Absorbed in their efforts to save themselves, they had forgotten that Jesus was on board. Peter, how could you be afraid when Jesus was in the boat? And he says, well, we were so caught up in trying to save ourselves that we just forgot he was there. Now, I've spent some time reading about Peter. Enough time, in fact, reading about Peter that I suspect that Peter would not like to get backed into a corner with a how could you question. In fact, Peter was the kind of person who, if you did back him into a corner, you better protect your ears and run because he'll come out swinging. So I suspect he will not be too pleased with my how could you kind of question. And that maybe he would say to me, wait a minute, Randy, what do you mean, how could I forget? How could I, as though I'm the only one, as though we're the only ones who've ever forgotten that Jesus was on board. In fact, he might say to me, Randy, let me ask you a question. You remember that time not too long ago you were driving the freeway right by your home? I remember, Peter, many times. But that day that motorcycle with that couple on it laid down on the freeway and skidded the freeway, just eating up pavement along the way, they were a bloody mess. You remember that? Oh, I remember that, Peter. A lot of us stopped, raced over to see if we could be of help. I remember that. What else happened there, Randy? Peter might ask. Well, Peter, it was a time when the AIDS virus was much in the news. And I saw these two young people laid out on the freeway, blood all over them. I wanted to help them. Yes, said Peter, I know you did, but I saw what you did. You were looking carefully at your hands, trying to make sure there were no cuts, no abrasions. Why were you doing that, Randy? How could you do that? Doesn't Jesus drive the 215 freeway? Or what about that time you were on the American Airlines flight coming into Dallas-Fort Worth Airport? I saw you. I saw that as that jet approached, I saw that you were remembering the news stories about a jet that approached that same runway and hit the wind shear and was slammed into the tarmac. Many people died. And I saw as that jet came in, you hit an air pocket. Boom. You had to swallow your heart just to be able to breathe. How could you be afraid, Randy? Doesn't Jesus fly American Airlines? And I would say to him, all right, Peter. All right, you've made your point. So we've both forgotten. I accept that. Let's make a deal. You don't ask me any how could you questions. I won't ask you any how could you questions. All right, says Peter. It's a deal. So I'm done with Peter. Through with the disciples. But I still have one more how could you question. And this how could you question is a question I want to ask of Jesus. I want to ask it respectfully because he's my Lord and my Savior. But I nevertheless have to ask the question. Maybe I would preface it a bit. Maybe I would say, I've never been on a boat in a storm at sea when the boat is about to go down. So I don't know exactly what I would do. If I were in a boat and the storm is blowing and the wind is whistling and the waves are crashing over the boat, I'm not sure what I would do. I might pray. I might panic. I might pray and panic. I might bail over the side. I might do something else over the side. There might be a lot of things that I would do. But Jesus, with all due respect, if there's a storm and the boat is about to go down, I can guarantee you, guaranteed, there is one thing I would not be doing. Even though I've never been in that situation, I can guarantee you that if the boat is being buffeted by the waves and is about to go down, Jesus, I would not be asleep. Guaranteed. So Jesus, with all due respect, how could you sleep? Now I wonder how Jesus would answer that question. Maybe Jesus would say to me, well, Randy, you have to understand, all my life I've been a very deep sleeper. All the way back from when I was a child, my mother had the hardest time waking me up. Jesus, get up, it's almost class. Maybe he would say that. Probably not. Maybe he would say, Randy, read the story. Read about the day that I had just had. A day filled with crowds, filled with people grabbing at me. Jesus, help me here. Jesus, heal me. Jesus, listen to me. There were people on every hand. They were clinging to me, grabbing at me. They sapped every ounce of energy from my body. By the time I got into that boat, by the time my head hit that pillow, I don't think I would have awakened had the boat gone down. I was utterly depleted. Maybe Jesus would say that. But you know, there's something I've noticed about Jesus as I've read of him in the gospel accounts. And that is that Jesus took part in common rabbinic ways of interacting with learners. Meaning that when people would come to him asking him a question, he would often hear them out, hear their question. Then he would turn around and ask them a question, which they would answer, and then their answer would stand as the answer. Jesus, we have a question for you. Say on. Jesus, should we give taxes to Caesar or not? Aha, question about taxes, about money. You have a coin? Yes, here's a coin. Looks at the coin. Whose image, whose inscription is on the coin? Caesar's. Well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, to God what's God's. Oh. Jesus, we have a question to ask you. We need to know where you got the authority to do these things that you're doing. Who gave you this authority? You want to ask me a question about authority? Well, let me ask you a question. John the Baptist, remember him? From whence came his authority? Who gave him authority? Just a moment, and they consult. You know, if we say he got it from... No, can't say that. If we say he get... No, they can't. Jesus, we don't know. All right, well, I want to answer your question. I mean, he had a custom of doing that. And so I come to him and I say, Jesus, how could you sleep when the boat is about to go down? Maybe Jesus would say to me, you know, Randy, I know something about your life. I remember when your family lived in Guadalajara, Mexico. And you would make those long driving trips all the way back to Keene, Texas. You remember that? And I would say, Jesus, how could I forget? I hated those trips. Tell us a bit about those trips. Oh, well, you see, Jesus, my father was the kind of driver that when he got behind the wheel of a car, he had one goal in mind: get there. Don't stop for anything. Well, you have to stop for gasoline. You had to stop for the border, but for nothing else. In fact, I remember growing up with my mother and my sister saying, there's got to be look, there's a station. Oh. And I remember Dad saying, oh, I hate to go back. There's got to be another one just up the way. I remember that. I also remember that this was long before iPhones and iPads and iPods and all of those modern conveniences. So that my sister and I would sit in the back seat, and there wasn't a whole lot to do. Well, while the sun was out, we could read, we could play some games, or we could do our favorite thing, fight. You know, we would draw that line on the back seat of the car. You cross that line, you won't live to see Texas. We could do that, Jesus. But I also remember one other thing about those trips. I remember those dangerous roads. Back in those days when we drove those roads, they were 2-lane affairs. They would descend into the barrancas, into the canyons. They would ascend on the other side, twisting, winding, pedestrians walking on the shoulders, animals loose. It was a dangerous trip. There were times when there were horrific crashes, fatalities. I remember that, Jesus. Maybe Jesus would say to me, and Randy, what would you do when the sun set? Oh, well, Jesus, when the sun set, there was nothing left to do. So when the sun set, it wasn't long before my sister and I would fall sound asleep in the back seat. And my father would continue to drive through the night. We would awaken as the sun peeked over the eastern horizon many hours later, hundreds of miles closer to our destination. And Jesus might say, Randy, how could you sleep? You, even as a teenager, knew the danger of those roads. You knew how one's life could be snuffed out in a moment, in an instant. How could you sleep? And I would say, oh, Jesus, that's easy to answer. You see, my father was a very good driver. I trusted him. And Jesus says, mine too. He's a good captain of seas and of ships and of souls. Story is told of an elderly lady in World War II London. The city was being bombed to pieces around her, and yet she seemed somehow strangely at rest. Friends asked her, how is it that you rest? How is it that you can sleep at night? You never know if you're going to awaken the next day. And she said, well, that's true. You never do know, do you? So here's what I do. Every night before bed, I kneel beside my bed, and I give my life once more to God. And I ask Him to be with me, to watch over me throughout the night. And then I get up, get into bed, and fall asleep, because I figure there's no use us both staying up. Jesus, how could you sleep? How could you rest in the storm? I trusted my Father. Now, I would like to leave it there, to walk away, to go eat lunch, and to feel at peace, to feel at rest. Accept that. Accept that. I think there might be one more how could you question being asked. This is not a question that I'm asking of those who were in the boat that night. This how could you question is a question that someone here today is asking me. Someone here today, through wounded soul, broken heart, tear-filled eyes, is asking me, Randy, how could you stand up there and suggest that we can rest in the providential care of God? You've served as a hospital chaplain at a major hospital. You've been there when a family has come to the end of the cancer road through many tears and many prayers. When they have asked you as the chaplain, why didn't God answer? You've been there in the emergency room when the broken and battered body of a young person has been brought in because someone took a drink and then took a drive and then took a life. How could you stand up there and suggest that we can rest in the providential care of God? You've been there in that office when the husband has told the wife, there is someone else, and furthermore, I'm in love with her and I'm leaving. And the wife has just dissolved. Her life coming apart at the seams. And then you dare to stand up there and tell us we can rest in the providential watch care of God. How could you do that? Well, I'd like to answer your question if you would permit me to attempt to do so. I'd like to say this. I'd like to remind us that as we read Scripture, as we encounter these stories, we encounter people who were children of their day and their time. Just as we are children of our day and time. They had beliefs, they had superstitions, just like we do. One of the ones that affects this story was this one. They didn't have all the opportunities and abilities that we have in our day and time. They didn't have skin diving equipment, mask and snorkel and fins. They didn't have scuba diving gear where they could go down and see what was down there. They didn't have underwater cameras and submarines. They didn't know what was down in the deep. And because of that, many superstitions had grown up, had arisen about what they called the deep, the ocean, any deep body of water. Predominant among those was this one. The belief that it was in the deep, in that deep darkness down there, that evil resided, that the demons presided. It was down there that evil waited to reach up and clutch you and plunge you into the depths, not just of physical death, but of spiritual destruction. So when the disciples are trying to keep the boat afloat on the lake that night, they are not merely seeking to save their physical lives, though they were trying to do that. This was much more than that. This was a spiritual battle. In their boat, the one they had forgotten was the one they believed to have been sent by God. And now the fury of demonic forces was coming after him and also after them. It threatened to reach up its spiny fingers and clutch that boat in its grasp and to plunge it into its eternally dark depths. And yet then, the one in whom they believed, the one whom they had forgotten, stood up in the boat, faced into the storm and said, "Enough! This far and no further." And like a mighty giant crumbling to its knees, not just the winds and the waves obeyed, but the very darkness itself heeded his word. When he said stop, it stopped. But understand this. This was not the only storm Jesus would face. He would face an even more fierce spiritual battle not too many months into the future. This spiritual battle would happen at a place called Calvary. Here at Calvary, every wind that the evil one could inspire would wreak its havoc upon Jesus. In this case, the boat with Jesus in it went down. But when it went down, it went all the way down, all the way to the very deepest parts of that darkness. And when his boat hit bottom, Jesus opened the drain. He pulled the plug. And at that moment in time, that sea began to drain out. It began to circle around the drain. It continues to do so to this very day in Brisbane, Australia. Continues to seep out, does the darkness. So much so that one of the occupants of that night's experience on the lake would one day be given a glimpse into the new heavens and the new earth. He would glimpse that new heaven and new earth and then would put quill pen to parchment and would write, "And I, John, saw the new heaven and the new earth, and there was no more sea." Drained dry. It is because of that that I have the temerity to stand before you today and suggest that when the storm blows, when the lightning flashes, when the thunder rolls in your life, I know what it is to forget that He's in my boat. But I'm also learning what it is to remember that He's there. And to understand that this book promises that there will come a day when we will dock on a distant, dry, safe shore. And because of that, I can answer your question by saying, because Jesus rested, I can rest too. Because Jesus trusted, I can trust too. Because Jesus triumphed, I will triumph too.